So, hello everyone. Our topic for this lecture video is population genetics. And under this topic, we have three subtopics. We will be discussing the definition. So, we have some terms that we need to define clearly before moving on to the next subtopic. So, we will be having computations on gene and genotype frequencies. And lastly, we will be discussing the Hardy-Weinberg law and the evolutionary forces that change these gene and genotypic frequencies. So to start with, we have here definitions. Definitions of these terms. We have population genetics, population, gene pool, gene frequency, and genotype frequency. So the definition of population genetics actually refers to genetic constitution or structure of a given population. So, bali, ang pinag-uusapan natin sa population genetic ay yung genetic specification of a population. And we know that this refers to the genetic composition of a population. So, ibig sabihin, we will be talking about alleles, genes, or genotypes. Okay? So, yan, with respect to a certain trait. Of course, a trait, under a particular trait, you have its respective phenotypes. By the way, ang pinag-uusapan pala natin na trait dito ay yung qualitative trait. Yan, qualitative trait o yung mga tinatawag natin na simply inherited traits. Okay? At a given time or generation, we usually refer to a particular period of time as a generation. Ibig sabihin, we talk about the parental generation, we talk about the offspring generation, the next offspring generation, etc. And aside from looking at the genetic structure or genetic composition of a population, we also study the factors or forces that brought about changes in the genetic composition of this population from one generation to the next. So, yan. Another definition of population genetics is the study of the gene and genotypic frequencies. Actually, yung genetic constitution or genetic structure refer to the frequencies of these genes and genotypes within a particular population. And with the frequency, since we are talking of generations, population or parent generation and offspring generation, we can actually use the gene frequencies of the parents or of the parental generation to predict the frequency of the next generation or of the offspring generation. Okay? And then next, population genetics refers or is the application of Mendelian inheritance to the population level. Ang pinag-uusapan kasi natin sa Mendelian genetics ay yung at the individual level, at the organismal level. Dito, pinag-uusapan na natin ay mga modes of inheritance, mechanisms of inheritance at the population level. So, ibig sabihin, parental population to the offspring population and the subsequent generations. How are these genes transmitted from parent, or how are these alleles transmitted from parent to offspring? Okay? And it is intimately bound up with the study of evolution and natural selection. With the changing frequencies, okay? With the changing frequencies, particularly of genes or alleles, we say that it is evolving. Ibig sabihin, nag-e-evolve yung isang population kapag yung parent generation, iba yung kanyang gene frequencies sa susunod na generation, sa offspring generation. Yan yung tinatawag nating evolution. And we want that a population should be evolving to adapt to the next, to adapt to any extreme conditions in the future, whether this is extreme environmental conditions, or occurrences of diseases, etc., occurrences of outbreaks, etc. Okay? And natural selection is actually a tool, or selection in particular is actually a tool that could change the gene arrays or genotypic or gene frequencies, or simply the genetic composition of a population. So, selection changes these frequencies. And with that, the population evolves. Okay. Since pinag-uusapan naman natin yung population, we have to define what a population is in the animal breeding sense or in the genetic sense. Pag sinabi nating population sa animal breeding, this should be a breeding group. Ibig sabihin, present yung breeder male and breeder female. Hindi maaaring ang male mo at saka female lang ang yung group dapat consist of breeder males and breeder females. Hindi maaaring ang sasabihin mo lang is a population is composed of males and females. That's not enough. The male should be a breeder. Ibig sabihin, should not be castrated. All right? So yun yung difference ng population pag pinag-uusapan natin sa animal breeding or sa genetics. Okay? So with that, since a breeding group, they are intermating kasi nga breeder animals sila, not castrated. Okay? Or not neutered in the case of females. So it's a group of individuals sharing a common gene pool. So, i-define natin mamaya what a gene pool is. Okay? So, group of intermating individuals, they should be breeder males and breeder females because they have to interbreed. Bakit kailangan mag-interbreed this one? To produce the offspring generation. Kasi nga, ang pinag-uusapan natin, ang focus natin sa population genetics is the changes in the genetic composition of a population from one generation to the next. Okay? So, it could be a group of, say for example, a group of landrace pigs consisting of breeder males and females, etc. So, it could refer to a breed, an entire species, a single herd or flock, or even a small group of animals within a herd. Okay? And this one, pwede rin a group of organisms of the same species, of course, that are found in the same area. Kasi nga, in the same area referring to a particular farm that a farmer manages or a breeder manages. And huwag nating kakalimutan na idagdag yung word na interbreed. Very important yon pag pinag-uusapan natin yung population. And population is the smallest unit that can evolve. Meaning to say, the smallest unit that can change over a period of generations. Alright. Proceed tayo sa next. Nabanggit natin kanina yung gene pool na a population is a group of individuals sharing a common gene pool. Ibig sabihin, ang gene pool, this refers to the totality of genes that could potentially be transmitted by individuals in a population. Meaning to say, yung mga group of genes or all copies of all the genes. Meaning to say, all the alleles of the genes present from the parent generation na pwedeng matransmit doon sa kanyang offspring generation. So that's your gene pool. Yan. All copies of all the genes or all the alleles of all genes at all loci, okay, within interbreeding population. So meron na naman tayong word na interbreeding because they have to produce the offspring generation. So ayan. All these statements or these bullets just mean the same. They are just rephrased, okay? Or they are just, the sentences are just reconstructed so that, which could be given in the exam. Sometimes, yung definition na ginagamit sa lecture, iba yung pagkakakonstruct sa exam. So, to guide you, maraming pwedeng reconstruction yung definition ng ating mga terms na dinidefine sa lecture. Okay? So, that's the gene pool. Lahat ng mga copies ng alternative versions of a gene or lahat ng mga alleles of all genes, all loci, within interbreeding populations. That is a gene pool. Okay? Proceed tayo sa next. Nabanggit naman natin kanina yung genetic structure. Ang pinag-uusapan natin kapag genetic structure, genetic composition or genetic specification. This just refers to the distribution of genotypes, their kinds and frequencies. Pag sinabi natin kind, we are actually referring to the homodominant na kind, heterozygous na genotype, and yung homozygous recessive na kind of genotype. Okay? So we use the gene A or the letter A to represent our gene. Okay? So with that, these are the kinds of genotypes. And there, pag sinabi naman nating frequencies, we usually express this in terms of fraction, or decimal, or percentage. Ano pa ba? Yan, yung usual na unit natin to refer to frequencies. Say for example, para makuha natin yung frequencies, just a short example, no? Sabihin natin, sa isang population, merong 10 na pigs. Okay? And doon sa 10 na pigs na yun, of course, meron tayong breeder male and female, gaya ng sinabi natin kanina. Sabihin natin, doon sa 10 na pigs, merong 3 na homozygous dominant A ang genotype. Meron naman 5 na heterozygous A ang genotype, at saka merong 2 na homorecessive A ang genotype. Sa Mendelian laws, or sa Mendelian genetics, we just express this as a ratio, a genotypic ratio. But for a particular result lang ng isang mating. But what we are referring to ay marami na, population level na. Okay? So this one is, kung gagawin mo siyang ratio, 3 homodominant A, 5 hetero A is 2 homorecessive A. To get the frequency, we just divide the number of individuals having this genotype by the total number of individuals in the population. So, to get the frequency, genotypic frequency of homodominant A, we divide 3 by 10 because we have 3 plus 5, 8 plus 2 equals 10. So, 3 over 10 or 0.3 na homodominant A. This one, 0.5 na heterozygous A, and this one, if you express this in frequency, you get 0.2 na homorecessive A. So, yun lang sinasabi niyang frequencies. Okay? So, genetic structure refers to the distributions of genotypes, particularly referring to the kinds and frequencies of these genotypes. Okay. So, ganyan din yung ibig sabihin ng pangatlo. This is the amount and distribution of genetic variation within and among populations. Okay? Now, proceed tayo sa next. The gene and genotypic frequencies. Nagbigay tayo ng example kanina how to compute genotypic frequencies. So, just a simple definition, proportion of each genotype in the population. Okay? Or the fraction of individuals within a given genotype. Parang lang yung computation kanina. Ito yung tinatawag nating genotypic frequency, this one, which can be, again, expressed in terms of fraction, decimal, or percentage. Okay? So, yan yung tinatawag nating genotypic frequency. Ilan sa mga individuals doon sa population being considered for a particular trait yung nagke-carry or nag-exhibit or nagpo-possess ng itong genotype na to. Yun lang ibig sabihin ng genotype or genotypic frequency. Next, we have the gene frequency. The gene frequency is sometimes referred to as the allelic frequency. Okay? Ito naman, ang tinatanong is the frequency of the dominant allele and the frequency of the recessive allele. Yun lang yung tinatanong. Ito, ang tinatanong, the frequency of the homodominant na genotype, the frequency of the heterogenotype, and the frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype. So that's the difference. Ito ang hinahanap natin, yung frequency ng dominant at saka yung frequency ng recessive allele. Okay, so the total number of genes represented by a particular allele in a population, whether that is dominant or recessive, and it could be the relative abundance or rarity. Sabihin yung frequency or rarity, how rare this gene or allele is in the population. Okay? Next, yan. Actually, yung second at saka third bullet, they just mean the same. Na-rephrase lang. Okay? How common a particular allele appears in a population. Yan yung tinatawag nating allele frequency or gene frequency. We will compute later kung paano makuha itong mga frequencies. And speaking of which, yun yung susunod nating i-discuss. So, gene and genotype frequencies. For those governed by no dominance or codominance and complete dominance. So, unahin natin yung mga genes governed by no dominance or codominance. Recall na pag sinabi nating no dominance or codominance, yung kanyang offspring. Yung offspring ng, say for example, gawin natin, bigay tayo ng example. The heterozygous genotype has a distinct phenotype. Ibig sabihin, iba yung phenotype ng heterozygous. Di ba usually, sa pinag-uusapan natin sa Mendelian or sa complete dominance, usually, basta present ang dominant allele, ang mapoproduce dominant na phenotype, right? Sa co-dominance or sa no dominance, it's not enough na present yung dominant allele to express the dominant phenotype. So wala tayong tinatawag na ito yung dominant phenotype, ito yung recessive na phenotype, because the term itself says no dominance. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, yung homodominant or yung parehong homozygous na capital letter or uppercase letter has a different genotype with our heterozygous genotype and another phenotype for the homorecessive. So, itong tatlo na to na genotypes, which we can produce from the alleles dominant or capital letter and the lowercase 1. Ito yung mga pwede nating genotypes na ma-produce. Ito, sa no dominance or incomplete dominance, iba-iba yung kanilang phenotype. Sa complete dominance, itong homozygous, dominant A at heterozygous, pareho yung kanyang phenotype. So, yan yung difference. So, dito sa no dominance, madali lang mag-compute ng genotypic frequency kasi nga, madidistinguish mo doon sa population, iba yung phenotype nito, iba yung phenotype nito, iba yung phenotype nito. So with that, itong phenotype na ito, ganito yung genotype. Itong phenotype na ito, ganito yung genotype, etc. So mas madali siyang i-compute actually versus sa ating complete dominance. Okay. So yan. Yung co-dominance kasi is they inherit both. Parang nagbo-blend. Say for example, this is applicable for your blood groups na MN. Kunwari, you have MN blood group. So meron tayong tinatawag na homozygous M, hetero N, hetero or itong combination ng M at saka N, and then NN or homozygous N. So ito yung genotypes na iba't iba ding yung kanilang ma-express na phenotype. So yan yung co-dominance. So parang pareho lang sila ng no dominance na type of gene actor. Okay? Next. So proceed tayo sa general formula. Okay? So take note, single locus with 2 alleles pa lang yung pinag-uusapan natin. Doon muna tayo sa easier part or simpler before we move on to the more complex. So this is the general formula. Wait, before we proceed, let's erase. Okay? Erase everything para mabasa natin na maayos. Okay. Let's proceed. General formula states that if n daw refers to the number of individuals in the population, ibig sabihin, ilan yung total individuals doon sa population? Yun lang yung n. Okay. N without the subscript, ha? Then the frequency of a particular genotype is, so F referring to frequency. Okay. How do we read this? The frequency of a particular genotype is equal to the number of individuals carrying this genotype or having this genotype divided by the total number of individuals in the population. So that is the general formula. So say for example, we have these genotypes na homodominant A, hetero A, and homorecessive A. Yung frequency of each of these genotypes ay ito. So we now replace yung genotype from the general formula ng genotype kung saan kinocompute natin yung frequency. So ano yung hinahanap natin? Yung frequency ng homodominant A. So the frequency of the homodominant A equals the number of individuals having this homodominant genotype divided by n. Ganon din sa hetero. Same pattern, frequency of the heterogenotype, hetero A or heterozygous A equals the number of individuals having heterozygous A divided by the total number of individuals represented by n. Finally, to get the frequency of the homorecessive A, we have number of individuals having the homozygous recessive A divided by n. Okay? So, yun yung pagkuha. So, as simple as that, yung pagkuha ng genotypic frequency for those genes governed or traits governed by no dominance or complete or co-dominance rather. 4 single locus with 2 alleles. Okay, we have here a note. Note that the frequency of all these genotypes should be equal to 1. The frequency of the homodominant genotype, frequency of the heterozygous genotype, and the frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype should be equal to 1. So you should always double check your computations. Dapat mag-equal siya sa 1. Bakit mag-equal siya sa 1? Because these events are mutually exclusive. Ang ibig sabihin, frequency nga yung pinag-uusapan natin eh. When we express frequency, di ba, in decimals, point something, percentage, what else? Fraction. So, dapat full number. Because if we add all this, yung tawag dito, yung dominant at saka recessive allele, or yung frequent or yung genotypes natin refers to 100% or totality ng mga individuals or ng mga genotypes or ng mga alleles present in the population. So dapat mag-equal siya sa 1 or 100% if we are using percentages as frequencies. Okay? So these events are mutually exclusive because they do not occur at the same time. Ibig sabihin, pag mutually exclusive yung events, they are disjoint events. Meaning to say, the occurrence of homodominant A ay, ibig sabihin, yung mga individuals na merong genotype na homozygous dominant A ay wala nang chance na, or wala nang chance na ang kanilang genotype ay heterozygous A for that particular locus. Okay? Hindi rin sila pwedeng magkaroon ng genotype at the same time ng homozygous recessive. So meaning to say they cannot have those both genotypes at the same time for a particular locus. So yun yung sinasabing mutually exclusive events. So that's for the genotypic frequency. Next, proceed tayo sa isang example para naman ma-illustrate yung mga pinagsasabi natin kanina. Okay? So we have here a problem in a population of Shorthorn cattle. There are 160 individuals with red coat color represented by, na ang kanilang genotype rather ay homozygous dominant. And 480 are roan. Sabihin roan yung kanilang coat color na ang genotype nila ay heterozygous A. And merong 360 individuals na ang kanilang phenotype ay white, na ang kanilang genotype ay homozygous recessive A. Determine the genotype and gene frequencies in the population. So, recall lang natin, no dominance, sabi natin kanina. So, kung makikita ninyo, yung homozygous dominant A at saka yung heterozygous A, magkaiba ng phenotype. Yung homozygous dominant A, red yung kanyang phenotype. Yung heterozygous A, roan yung kanyang phenotype. Yan yung ating example ng no dominance. Kasi wala tayong tinatawag na dominant allele at saka recessive allele. Meaning to say, the presence of the capital letter or the uppercase letter will not mask or conceal the effect of the recessive allele. So, ang tanong, gene. I-compute natin yung gene and genotype frequencies. Okay? So, before we proceed to that, ilista muna natin, tabulate natin. So, meron tayong 3 phenotypes and 3 genotypes. So, each genotype has a distinct phenotype. And nakalagay dito sa third column yung N, referring to the number of individuals. Okay, so this one, number of individuals having red coat color or this homozygous A, homozygous uppercase A is 160. So 160 from this, correct? And then, number of individuals carrying the heterozygous genotype or yung mga roan, yung kulay, 480. And sa white individuals, 360 or yung homo, lowercase a. So you add this, ilan yung total population? 1,000. Kailangang i-add kasi gaya ng sinabi natin kanina, ang formula is number of individuals having that particular genotype divided by the total number of individuals in the population. So we have to get the total so that we can compute for the frequency of each genotype. Okay. So proceed tayo. Compute natin the frequency of the genotype homozygous uppercase A or yung sanay tayo na bigkasin, frequency of the homodominant A, although wala namang dominant na allele dito at saka wala namang recessive sa no dominance. So this one, we just divide 160 from here divided by 1,000. From the total number of individuals we produce, 0.16. Correct? And then for the frequency of the heterozygous individuals, 0.48 because we divide 480 by 1,000. Lastly, for the frequency of the homozygous na lowercase a, we have 360 divided by 1,000, 0.36. Just to check, 0.16 plus 0.48 plus 0.36 equals 1. So, for checking lang yung pagko-compute natin ng 1. So, as you can see, the genotypic frequency is equal to the phenotypic frequency because each genotype has a distinct phenotype. Ang phenotypic frequency is just the frequency of the phenotypes, correct? Meron tayong 160 red, 480 na roan, and 360 na white. So, 0.16 na red, 0.48 na roan, and 0.36 na white. Yan lang yung sinasabi nitong statement. Genotypic frequency, this one, is equal to the phenotypic frequency, this one. Kasi nga, each genotype has a distinct phenotype. Proceed tayo sa next. Paano kaya computein yung gene frequency? So, na-compute na natin yung genotypic frequency. Proceed tayo sa gene frequency. There are actually two methods of computing yung gene frequency. Okay? Number one is by direct counting. Sinabing direct counting kasi bibilangin natin yung mga alleles na dominant or capital letter at saka mga alleles na recessive doon sa population. Okay? So the frequency of this capital letter A or the frequency of the dominant allele A is this. We just get the number of individuals or number of dominant alleles divided by 2n. Ginamit natin yung 2n because each individual each n or each individual has 2 copies of the allele. 2 copies. Ibig sabihin, pair, allelic pair. So, one genotype has 2 pairs. Or 2 alleles rather. 2 alleles in a pair. Whether that is a combination of capital letter, both capital letter, or capital letter and recessive, or parehong recessive, or parehong lowercase. So, that's how we get yung kanyang frequency of the dominant allele. Okay? Next, paano natin makukuha or paano natin mabibilang ito? So, we compute this by referring to this. So, bibilangin natin yung mga individuals na merong genotype na ito, homodominant A. And then, imumultiply natin yung bilang ng mga individuals na may homodominant A by 2. Bakit 2? Because they have 2 copies of the allele. Yan. Dito naman, i-add natin yung bilang ng mga heterozygotes. Take note na yung coefficient ay 1. Wala siyang ilagay na 2, 3, or 4. Ibig sabihin, 1 yung nasa tabi ng N. Correct? Ibig sabihin nun, isang copy lang kasi ang meron sila na dominant allele or yung capital letter A. Kaya wala siyang coefficient na 2, 3, or 4. Okay? So, yan. So, 2 ginamit. Ulitin ko, 2 yung nasa tabi ng N. Kasi each individual na merong homodominant na genotype ay merong copy, dalawang kopya ng dominant allele. And then we divide it by 2n. 2n is the total number of individuals times 2. Times 2 kasi merong dalawang alleles ang isang genotype. Correct? Ganon din sa frequency of the recessive allele. Pareho lang. Papalitan lang natin ito. Again, kung titingnan ninyo, we multiply the number of individuals having these homorecessive na genotypes by 2. Kasi yung mga individuals na yon, dalawang recessive ang kanilang kine-carry. Ito, iisa lang yung recessive allele na kanilang kine-carry. So, wala na tayong magiging coefficient. So, we apply these formulas sa pagkuha ng gene frequency. Okay? So, nandito na. Meron tayong table. Ito yung part na wala kanina. So, ito yung dinagdag natin or ni-replace natin doon sa column kanina na genotypic frequency. So, we have to count the number of genes kasi nga nasa direct counting method tayo. So, ilan yung dominant alleles ng mga individuals having this genotype. So, yung mga individuals, 160, correct? 160 individuals having this genotype. And again, imumultiply natin siya by 2. Kaya, nakuha yung 320. Because itong mga 160 individuals na to, sorry, they have dalawang kopya. Each individual carries 2 copies of the dominant allele. Ganito rin dito. Okay, proceed muna tayo dito. Sa recessive na allele, wala sila. Kaya 0. Kung titingnan mo ang kanyang genotype, wala siyang recessive allele. So, 0. Okay? Dito, 480. Bakit 480 na dominant allele? Kasi, iisang kopya lang naman. So, hindi na natin siya i-multiply by 2. So, 480. Itong mga heterozygous individuals, 480 ang bilang ng mga dominant alleles. And 480 din na recessive from here. Correct? And then another, sa white or sa mga homorecessive, wala silang dominant allele. Itong column na to. And meron silang 720 na recessive alleles because yung mga 360 natin na individuals, each of them carry 2 copies. So 360, multiply it by 2, we have 720. So kapag i-add mo ito, i-erase lang natin. Okay? So if you add itong mga number of genes, okay? 320 plus 480, that is 800. 0 plus 480 plus 720, that's 1,000. So if you add this, 800 plus 1,200, sorry, this is 2,000. So ito na yung tinatawag nating 2N. Kasi nga, each individual, ng kanilang genotype, merong dalawang alleles for it to be expressed. Okay. So, computin na natin yung frequency of the dominant or the capital letter A and the frequency of the recessive A. Following the formula, we just apply, substitute the values, N of this. So, ilan? Number of N subscript dominant A refers to the number of dominant alleles A, which is galing dito 320 plus 480, yan na yung na-compute natin. 800 divided by 2,000, that's 0.4. Okay? Next, frequency of the recessive allele, we just add this, yan. So that's 1,200 already. Divided by 2,000, which is 0.6. Take note that the frequency of the dominant allele plus the frequency of the recessive allele should be equal to 1 because again, these events are mutually exclusive. Okay, so always double check your answers before you encircle them. Okay, so yan yung ibig sabihin, in the population, 40% carries the dominant allele A and 60% carries the recessive allele A. Okay, so that's for the direct counting method. Okay, next we proceed to the second method, which is computing gene frequencies using known genotype frequencies, meaning to say you have to have the genotypic frequencies first before you can compute for the gene frequencies or the allelic frequencies. So this is just the formula for computing gene frequencies. So this is your frequency of the dominant allele A, frequency of the recessive A allele. Okay, these are your known genotypic frequencies. Remember that we have already computed for the frequency of this homodominant genotype and the frequency of the heterozygous genotype. So we just substitute values here. Input the frequency of the homozygous genotype plus half of the frequency of the heterozygous genotype. Why half? Because itong genotype na ito ay kalahati lang or 50% or half lang ng kanyang genotype present yung dominant allele. Same is true with the frequency of the recessive allele. We just input the frequency of the computed recessive genotype plus half of the frequency of the heterozygous genotype. Because again, half of those individuals or half of the alleles of the heterozygous individuals have the recessive allele A. So, yun lang yung pag-compute using genotypic frequencies. Next, we proceed to an example. Okay? Gamitin natin yung previous example natin kanina when we computed for the allele frequency or gene frequency of using direct counting. So ito yung genotypic frequency, 0.16, 0.48, and 0.36. So nakalagay siya dito because we will use this when computing for the gene frequencies. So we just substitute the values. Recall that our formula for the frequency of the dominant allele is the frequency of the homozygous genotype, A, homodominant A, this one, and the frequency, half of the frequency of the heterozygous genotype. So 0.16 plus 1/2 of 0.48. So 1/2 of 0.48 is 0.24. We add it to 0.16, we get 0.4. And the frequency of the recessive allele is parang yung formula lang ng pagkuha ng frequency of the dominant allele, just replacing yung genotypes kung saan natin siya pwedeng i-compute. So we use the frequency of the homorecessive allele or homorecessive genotype plus half of the frequency of the heterozygous genotype. So substituting these values, we get 0.36 plus half of 0.48, we get 0.6. Or if you have already computed the frequency of one allele, we can just compute. Say for example, this is X. To compute for the frequency of the recessive allele, we just get 1. We can use 1 minus F of A or 1 minus X. Because the frequency of the dominant and the recessive allele is equal to 1. They are mutually exclusive events. So no need to substitute the values here if you have already this value. You just write or input in your calculator 1 minus this one. 1 minus 0.4 is just 0.6. Okay? Next, we proceed to computing the gene and genotype frequencies when the trait or the gene is governed by complete dominance. Yung kanina, yung ginawa natin kanina is no dominance or codominance. Pag sinabing no dominance or codominance, its genotype has a distinct phenotype. Wala tayong tinatawag na dominant at saka recessive na allele. Dapat, technically, pag no dominance. No nga no dominance. Okay. So recall that complete dominance, yung mga homozygous dominants or homozygous dominant genotypes and heterozygous individuals have the same phenotype. This one, homodominant and hetero, same sila ng phenotype. Okay. Therefore, it is not possible to tell how many of each the genotypes are present in the population unless the mating system is known. Ibig sabihin, you cannot automatically compute for the frequency of the homodominant A, frequency of the heterozygous, and frequency of the recessive. Okay? Ito, hindi mo agad mako-compute. But this one, you can compute because you know in the population that the individuals showing the recessive phenotype, ang genotype nila ay homozygous recessive din. Okay? So, assuming that a population at equilibrium with gene frequencies, F of A, F of dominant A, which is equal to lowercase p, and frequency of the recessive allele equal to lowercase q, then ang kanilang genotypic frequency would be this one, p squared plus 2pq and q squared. Meaning, the frequency of the of the homodominant would be p squared. The frequency of the heterogenotype would be 2pq, and the frequency of the homorecessive would be q squared. F of dominant A, P, F of recessive A is Q. So, yan. Kaya, itinabi dito sa genotype na to refer to the genotype of homodominant A. P squared, homodominant A, 2pq, hetero A, and Q squared, homorecessive A. Yan yung kanyang genotypic frequency. Okay? And to get, di ba sabi natin kanina, na para makuha, since alam kasi natin, distinct siya sa population, yung mga individuals na merong recessive phenotype, kanilang matik na ang kanilang genotype ay homorecessive. So, ito yung pwede nating makompute. So, ibig sabihin, this is known already. Okay? So, since this is known, proceed tayo muna sa pag-compute ng gene frequency. Gene frequency represented by what? F of recessive allele A. Kasi, recessive ang allele na present dito sa genotype na yan. So, to get the frequency of the recessive allele A, we have to get the square root. Bakit square root? Kasi nga, ito ay Q squared. So, to get the value of Q, which is F of recessive A, to get the square root. Okay? So, yan yung formula ng pagkuha ng frequency of recessive allele. Square root of the frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype. Siyempre, since P plus Q is equal to 1, or F of dominant A plus F of recessive A equals 1, we can just subtract to get the frequency of the dominant allele B 1 minus the frequency of the recessive allele A, or 1 minus the square root of the this should be lowercase. Sorry. Since we use letter A, gamitin natin ang letter A, This should be frequency of dominant A. So, 1 minus the frequency, square root of the frequency of homorecessive A. That should be written as the formula. So, let's correct. Let's check. Let's rewrite. Okay? Para hindi magulo. So, to get the frequency of the dominant B, the formula should be 1 minus the frequency of recessive allele. Or if you write this, 1 minus the square root of the frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype. Okay? Dahil ganun yung ginawa natin, these are estimates already. So, para yung mga values now, itong gene frequencies, we call these estimates. Okay? Sorry, this should be A. Sorry. Kasi A ang ginamit. So, estimates. So, to represent or to designate na estimate yung mga kinompute natin na values, estimate kasi hindi naman tayo sure na yun yung actual. But, yun yung expected. Okay? Estimate ang ginamit natin. So, kung estimate siya, meron siyang hat sa taas. Yan. Yung mga values na P and Q, P is the frequency of the dominant allele, Q is the frequency of the recessive allele. So, since estimate or kinompute natin yung expected or yung estimate na values, lagyan natin ng hat. Pag meron siyang hat, ibig sabihin, estimate. Okay? Again, same principle, yung mga allele frequencies, P and Q, should also equal to 1. And the genotypic frequencies P squared, 2P, Q, and Q squared should also equal to 1. Okay? 1 referring to the totality of all the genes and totality of all the genotypes present in the population. Meaning 100%. Okay? So proceed tayo sa example sa gene and genotypic frequencies. So say for example, we have here a population of pigs and 640 of them ay merong, this should be erect. Okay? Erect ears and this should be drooping. So palitan natin. So, 640 daw doon sa population ay erect yung kanilang ears. And then 360 doon sa population ay, of course, opposite ng erect is drooping yung kanilang ears. And alam natin previously na kapag erect yung, tawag dito, yung, although indicated here, erect yung dominant phenotype. Okay? Erect yung dominant phenotype at saka recessive yung drooping na phenotype. Okay? So, 640 are erect. So, na-indicate naman dito yung kanilang genotypes. So, ito yung mga individuals na merong homodominant A at saka heterozygous A. So, we can what can we easily compute dito sa mga values given? Since itong mga grouping, this should be erect. Yung 640 should be erect. I shouldn't have erased this. Erect and then drooping. Ang gagawin natin is unahin nating i-compute yung genotypic frequency ng recessive allele. Okay? So, ito, diniretso kasi siya. Diniretso siya. Pero, pwede nating computein muna yung genotypic frequency. But since ito na yung nakalagay, because we have assumed na yung population is in equilibrium, by the way, pag sinabi nating in equilibrium yung population, yung kanyang gene frequencies P and Q, dominant allele frequencies and recessive allele frequencies are constant across generation. Pag sinabi natin constant across generations, pareho yung P and Q or yung gene frequency sa parent generation and the succeeding generations. Yun yung ibig sabihin. So, nilalagyan natin ng hat kasi nga estimate ang ginagawa natin. So, we estimate the recessive allele frequency represented by Q hat, which is computed as the square root of the frequency of the homorecessive na genotype. We just substitute the values, 360 over 1,000, square root, we have 0.6. So, P hat, 1 minus q hat because p plus q equals 1. So 1 minus q hat equals your p. So 1 minus 0.6, you get 0.4. Okay? Ito na yung estimates of the dominant and recessive allele frequencies. Now, to get the genotypic frequency, we use the gene frequencies. The estimated gene frequencies to get, since meron tayong p squared for homodominant A, 2pq for hetero na genotype, and q squared for homorecessive na genotype, we just substitute the values. P squared, this is your p, 0.4 squared equals 0.16, 2pq, 2 times your p, which is 0.4, times q, which is 0.6, so 2 times 0.4 times 0.6, we have 0.48. And then q squared equals 0.6, yung q natin 0.6, you square it, that is 0.36. Note that when you add all of the frequencies of these genotypes, it should add to 1. And further note that ito, na genotype, yung mga individuals having the erect with the genotype homodominant and hetero, this should be erect na phenotype. Frequency of individuals having the erect na phenotype equals 0.64. 0.16 plus 0.48. This one equals 0.64. So kung kukunin mo yung phenotypic frequency ng erect na phenotype, we have 640, divide lang natin siya by the total number of individuals, that is 0.64. So nakuha natin ngayon yung gene and genotypic frequencies. Okay? So nilagay lang dito para ipakita na same yung result. Okay, na-compute natin, napatunayan natin na using the computed genotypic frequencies, we can produce the phenotypic frequencies. Okay. So for now, that would be our discussion for this lecture video. We will discuss the Hardy-Weinberg law as well as the evolutionary forces that change gene and genotypic frequencies next time. So thank you very much, everyone.